Obese noblewoman mocks lonely lumberjack until he makes her cry, saying no to a marriage proposal today. I'm going to tell you a story that took place in the wildlands of Colorado, back around the year 1873. A tale of pride, prejudice, and how true love can blossom in the most unlikely places. If you enjoy it, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Now, sit back and let's journey together to the Old West. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Silver Ridge, Colorado. Jake Sullivan wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his calloused hand, leaving a streak of dirt across his forehead. He'd been hauling timber since dawn, and his clothes reeked of horse sweat, pine sap, and honest labor. "Come on, Jake," called out Tom Bradley from across the street. "The boys are waiting at Murphy's. First round's on me." Jake grinned, adjusting the heavy axe on his shoulder. At 32, he was the best lumberjack in the territory, and after a hard day's work, nothing sounded better than a cold beer with his crew. He started across the street toward the saloon when the thunder of hooves and wheels made him pause. A magnificent black carriage rolled into town, pulled by 4 matched grays that must have cost more than Jake made in 5 years. The door bore the ornate crest of the Whitmore family, the wealthiest landowners in 3 counties. Jake stepped back to let it pass, but the driver pulled the horses to a sudden stop right in front of him. The carriage door swung open, and out stepped Lady Margaret Whitmore herself. Jake had heard tales of the Eastern-educated daughter who'd returned to manage her late father's estate, but he'd never seen her up close. She was a large woman, dressed in layers of burgundy silk despite the heat, her face flushed and perspiring beneath an elaborate feathered hat. "Driver," she called imperiously, "why have we stopped in this place?" Her nose wrinkled as she surveyed the dusty street. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," the driver replied nervously. "The wheel's caught in a rut. I'll need help to free it." Margaret's gaze swept the street and landed on Jake. Her eyes, a startling shade of green, narrowed as she took in his appearance. The sawdust in his dark hair, the sweat-stained shirt clinging to his broad shoulders, the dirt under his fingernails. "You there?" she said, pointing a gloved finger at him. "Lumberjack, come help with the carriage." Jake's jaw tightened. He wasn't anyone's servant, but his mother had raised him to be polite to ladies, even rude ones. He set down his axe and moved toward the carriage. As he approached, Margaret took a step back, her hand flying to her nose. "Good heavens!" she exclaimed loudly enough for half the street to hear. "When was the last time you bathed? You smell like you've been sleeping in the stables." Heat rushed to Jake's face. His friends, Tom, Will Henderson, and Charlie Pike had emerged from the saloon to see what the commotion was about. They stood watching from the boardwalk, close enough to hear every word. "I've been working, ma'am," Jake said quietly, fighting to keep his temper in check. "Honest work tends to leave a man less than fresh." Margaret laughed, a cruel tinkling sound that carried down the street. "Honest work? Is that what you call it? Rolling around with horses?" She turned to her companion, a thin woman who'd remained in the carriage. "Prudence, smell this creature. I've encountered barnyard animals with more pleasant aromas." The thin woman tittered nervously, fanning herself with a silk fan. Jake's hands clenched into fists. He could hear Tom muttering angrily behind him, and Will had taken a step forward as if to intervene. But Jake held up a hand to stop them. He wouldn't give this pompous woman the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. "The wheel, ma'am," he said through gritted teeth. "Do you want help or not?" Margaret waved her hand dismissively. Yes. Do something useful with those muscles of yours. Though I suppose I should be grateful. At least you're downwind." Jake knelt by the wheel, biting back the dozen retorts that sprang to his lips. With one powerful heave, he lifted the corner of the carriage while the driver urged the horses forward. The wheel popped free of the rut, and Jake stepped back, brushing his hands on his pants. "There," he said curtly. "You're free to go." Margaret climbed back into the carriage without a word of thanks. As the door closed, Jake heard her say to her companion, "Really, Prudence, the quality of men in these frontier towns. It's no wonder I've had to import workers from Denver. The local stock is barely civilized." The carriage rolled away, leaving Jake standing in the street with his fists clenched and his pride in tatters. His friends surrounded him immediately. "That pompous witch," Tom spat. "Who does she think she is? Money don't give her the right to talk to you like that," Will added, his weathered face creased with anger. Charlie, the youngest of their group at barely 20, looked ready to chase after the carriage. "We ought to teach her some manners, Jake. Nobody talks to one of ours that way." Jake picked up his axe, his knuckles white around the handle. "Leave it be, boys. Leave it be." Tom stared at him incredulously. "Jake, she humiliated you in front of half the town." I said, "Leave it." Jake's voice was hard as granite. "She's not worth our time." But as he followed his friends into Murphy's saloon, the sting of her words lingered like the ache of an old wound. He'd grown up poor, worked since he was 12, and built his reputation with sweat and determination. He'd never been ashamed of honest labor until today. Until she'd looked at him like he was something she'd scrape off her fancy shoes. Inside Murphy's, the usual crowd had gathered. Word traveled fast in Silver Ridge, and Jake could feel the weight of sympathetic stares. He ordered a whiskey instead of beer, needing something stronger to wash away the bitter taste in his mouth. "Don't let her get to you," said a gentle voice beside him. Jake turned to see Mary Chen, who ran the general store with her husband. Margaret Whitmore's been making enemies since she came back from Boston. "Money can't buy class." "Jake," he managed, a tight smile. "Thanks, Mary." But the damage was done. As Jake sat with his friends, their attempts at normal conversation fell flat. He could still hear her laughter, still see the disgust in those green eyes. For the first time in his life, Jake Sullivan felt small. Outside, the sun was setting over the Rockies, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. It had been just another day in Silver Ridge, until Lady Margaret Whitmore had rolled into town and turned Jake's world upside down. He had no idea that this was only the beginning, that the proud woman who'd mocked him would soon become entangled in his life in ways neither of them could imagine. For now, all Jake knew was the burn of humiliation and the desire to never cross paths with Lady Margaret Whitmore again. 3 days had passed since the incident on Main Street, but the story had spread through Silver Ridge like wildfire. Jake threw himself into his work with unusual fervor, attacking the tall pines as if each swing of his axe could chop away the memory of Margaret Whitmore's mocking laughter. "Easy there, Jake," called out Ben Cooper, the lumber camp foreman. "Save some trees for tomorrow." Jake paused, wiping sweat from his brow. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of snow from the distant peaks. Around him, his crew worked in practiced rhythm. The steady thunk of axes, the warning calls before a tree fell, the groaning crash as another giant pine met the earth. "Just trying to make quota," Jake muttered, but Ben wasn't fooled. "This about that Whitmore woman?" Ben asked quietly. He was one of the few men Jake considered a true friend, having worked together for over a decade. "The boys told me what happened." Jake's jaw tightened. "It's nothing." "Nothing," Ben snorted. "You've been working like a man possessed. Yesterday, you cleared more timber than any 3 men combined. At this rate, you'll work yourself into an early grave." Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Through the trees came a group of riders, and Jake's stomach sank as he recognized the lead figure, Richard Whitmore, Margaret's younger brother. Richard was everything his sister was not. Lean where she was large, charming where she was abrasive. He dressed like a dandy in a spotless gray suit, but Jake had heard he was shrewd in business, managing much of the Whitmore empire, while Margaret handled the estate's social affairs. "Gentlemen," Richard called out, dismounting with practiced ease. His eyes found Jake immediately. "Mr. Sullivan, might I have a word?" Jake set down his axe, aware of his crew watching curiously. "What can I do for you, Mr. Whitmore?" Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I heard about the unfortunate incident with my sister earlier this week. I've come to apologize on behalf of the family." "No need," Jake said stiffly. "What's done is done." "Nevertheless," Richard continued, pulling out a leather pouch that jingled with coins, "I'd like to compensate you for any inconvenience." The camp fell silent. Jake stared at the pouch, understanding flooding through him. They were trying to buy his silence, to smooth over Margaret's behavior with gold. "Keep your money," Jake said, his voice dangerously low. Richard's smile faltered. "Come now, Sullivan. I'm trying to make things right. My sister can be difficult, but surely we can resolve this as gentlemen." "Gentlemen?" Jake laughed bitterly. "Your sister made it clear she doesn't consider me a gentleman. I'm just a smelly lumberjack." "Remember?" Richard's face flushed. She spoke hastily. "Margaret has been under considerable stress since our father's death. Managing the estate, the social obligations. I said keep your money." Jake picked up his axe. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Richard's polite mask slipped, revealing something harder underneath. "You're making a mistake, Sullivan. The Whitmores have considerable influence in this territory. It would be wise to accept our friendship. Is that a threat? Merely an observation. Richard remounted his horse. My sister may have been ungracious, but pride is a luxury men in your position can ill afford. Jake watched them ride away, fury burning in his chest. First humiliation, now condescension. The Whitmores seemed determined to remind him of his place. Jake, Ben said quietly, maybe you should have taken the money. The Whitmores own half the contracts in the territory. They could make things difficult for us. Let them try, Jake growled, turning back to his work. But Ben's words proved prophetic. Over the next 2 weeks, strange things began happening. A shipment of supplies arrived late, then another was cancelled altogether. The railway company, which had always been reliable, suddenly claimed there were delays in transporting their timber. When Jake went to town for provisions, he noticed certain merchants were suddenly out of stock of items they'd always carried. The breaking point came when Jake arrived at Murphy's saloon to find his credit had been cut off. I'm sorry, Jake, Murphy said, looking genuinely pained. But I got bills to pay, and the Whitmore Bank holds my note. They made it clear that extending credit to certain individuals would be inadvisable. Jake slammed his fist on the bar. This is about that day with the carriage, isn't it? Murphy didn't need to answer. His silence said everything. As Jake stormed out of the saloon, he nearly collided with someone entering. To his shock, it was Margaret Whitmore herself, accompanied by her thin companion and 2 burly guards. For a moment, they stood frozen, staring at each other. Jake noticed she looked different. Her face was less flushed, her dress simpler than before, but her green eyes still held that superior gleam. Mr. Sullivan, she said coolly. Lady Whitmore. He started to brush past her, but her voice stopped. Him. I heard you refused my brother's offer of compensation. Jake turned back, anger flaring. I don't want your money. I want to be left alone to make an honest living. Honest living, she laughed, that same tinkling sound that had haunted him. How noble. Tell me, Mr. Sullivan, how is that honest living working out for you lately? The pieces clicked into place. You're behind this. The contracts, the suppliers, all of it. Margaret smiled, a cat-like expression of satisfaction. I have no idea what you mean, though I did hear the lumber business has been having difficulties. Such a volatile market. Why? Jake demanded. Because I wouldn't grovel. Because I wouldn't take your brother's bribe. Because, Margaret said, stepping closer, and Jake caught a whiff of expensive perfume. You need to learn your place. Men like you think a strong back and a handsome face entitle you to respect. But respect is earned, Mr. Sullivan, through breeding, education, and refinement qualities you sadly lack. Jake's hands clenched. And women like you think money can buy everything, including the right to treat people like dirt. Margaret's eyes flashed. How dare you? No, Jake interrupted, his voice rising. How dare you? You know nothing about me, about the life I've lived, or the work I do. You judge me by the dirt under my fingernails and the honest sweat on my brow. But at least I earned every callus on these hands. What have you earned, Lady Whitmore? What have you built? Or do you just live off what your daddy left you? Margaret's face went white, then red. For a moment, Jake thought she might slap him. Instead, she drew herself up to her full height. You're right, Mr. Sullivan. I know nothing about you. And I have no desire to learn. You're beneath my notice. She swept past him into the saloon. Enjoy your honest poverty. I'm sure it will keep you warm through the winter. Jake stood in the street, trembling with rage and something else. A strange electricity that had crackled between them in that moment of confrontation. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Margaret Whitmore was his enemy now, using her wealth and power to destroy his livelihood out of petty spite. But as he walked home in the gathering dusk, Jake couldn't forget the flash of something hurt. Vulnerability. That had crossed her face when he'd mentioned her father. There was more to Margaret Whitmore than the cruel, laughing woman who'd humiliated him. Not that it mattered. She'd drawn the battle lines. And Jake Sullivan had never backed down from a fight. The war between the lumberjack and the lady had begun, and neither realized how much it would cost them, or how it would change them both forever. The first snow of October fell like a whispered threat across Silver Ridge. Jake stood at the window of the small cabin he shared with his younger brother Danny, watching the white flakes dance in the lamplight. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret Whitmore had declared war on his livelihood, and the effects were beginning to show. We're down to beans and cornbread again, Danny said from the kitchen. At 25, he had the same dark hair and blue eyes as Jake, but where Jake was solid muscle, Danny was lean and quick. A mining accident 2 years ago had left him with a permanent limp, ending his career underground. Now he kept house and took in mending to contribute what he could. "I'll figure something out," Jake said, though he wasn't sure how. The Whitmore stranglehold had tightened. No merchant in town would extend credit, and the lumber contracts had all but dried up. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Jake opened it to find Tom Bradley standing in the swirling snow, his face grim. "Jake, you need to come quick. There's been an accident." Jake's blood ran cold. "The lumber camp?" "No." Tom's expression was strange. "It's the Whitmore woman. Her carriage went off the mountain road. She's trapped." For a moment, Jake stood frozen. Then he grabbed his coat. "How bad?" "Bad enough. The carriage is hanging off the edge of Devil's Drop. One wrong move, and it goes over. Sheriff's asking for every able-bodied man to help." Jake hesitated. After everything Margaret had done, part of him wanted to let someone else play hero, but his mother's voice echoed in his memory. A man's character isn't measured by how he treats his friends, but how he treats his enemies. "Let me get my rope," he said. 20 minutes later, Jake stood with a crowd of townsmen at Devil's Drop, a notorious curve where the mountain road skirted a 200-foot cliff. Through the driving snow, he could see the black carriage tilted at a precarious angle, its rear wheels hanging over empty space. The horses had broken free, leaving only splintered traces and the groaning protest of wood against rock. "She's still inside," Sheriff Watson called out. "Her driver was thrown clear, but he says Lady Whitmore and her companion are trapped. The door's jammed, and the whole thing could go any second." Jake assessed the situation with the eye of a man used to dangerous work. The carriage balanced on a knife's edge, held only by its front wheels and the friction of its undercarriage against the rocky ground. One person's weight in the wrong place would send it plummeting. "We need someone light to go out there," the sheriff was saying. "Someone who knows knots and rope work." Jake stepped forward. "I'll go." The sheriff looked relieved, then uncomfortable. "Jake, considering the situation between you and Lady Whitmore, you want her saved or not?" Jake asked bluntly. He tied one end of his strongest rope around his waist, while Tom and the others secured the other end to a sturdy pine. Dropping to his belly, Jake began inching across the icy ground toward the carriage. He could hear crying from inside, not Margaret, but the thin woman. "Prudence. Hold still in there," Jake called out. "Don't move." He reached the carriage and peered through the window. Margaret sat rigid, her green eyes wide with terror, one arm around Prudence, who was sobbing hysterically. Their eyes met, and Jake saw the recognition dawn on her face, followed by a complex mix of emotions: shock, hope, and something that might have been shame. "Mr. Sullivan." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Don't move," Jake repeated. "I'm going to try the door." The door was indeed jammed, twisted by the impact. Jake braced himself carefully and pulled. Nothing. He pulled harder, feeling the carriage shift ominously. "Stop," Margaret cried out. "It's moving." Jake paused, thinking fast. The window was too small for Margaret to fit through, and breaking it might shift the weight fatally. He made a decision. "Lady Whitmore, I'm going to come in through the other side. When I do, you need to move very slowly toward me. Can you do that?" She nodded, her face pale but determined. Jake carefully circled to the cliffside of the carriage. This was the dangerous part. His added weight on the wrong side could tip the balance. He could hear the men above shouting warnings, feel their tension through the rope around his waist. The far door opened more easily. Jake swung inside, the carriage groaning and tilting further. Prudence screamed. "Quiet," Jake commanded. "Prudence, you first." Slowly. The thin woman was nearly paralyzed with fear. Margaret, to Jake's surprise, slapped her companion sharply. "Prudence, do as he says." Shocked into motion, Prudence crawled toward Jake. He helped her through the door. Where other men had formed a human chain to pass her to safety. Now came the hard part. Jake and Margaret were alone in the tilting carriage. Snow swirled through the open door, and he could hear the ominous creak of wood beginning to splinter. "Your turn," he said. Margaret tried to move, then gasped. "My dress. It's caught." Jake looked down. The heavy burgundy silk was pinned beneath a twisted piece of metal. He pulled out his knife. "No," Margaret protested. "This dress costs your life, or your dress. Lady Whitmore. Choose fast." Their eyes met again. and this time he saw not the haughty noblewoman but a frightened person facing death. She nodded. Jake cut through the expensive fabric, freeing her. As he did, the carriage shifted violently. They both froze. "When I say, move, we go together," Jake said. "Fast." Margaret nodded, her hand unconsciously gripping his arm. Now, they lunged for the door as the carriage began its final slide. Jake pushed Margaret through first, then dove after her. For a heart-stopping moment, he felt empty air beneath him, heard the crash of the carriage hitting rocks far below. Then, strong hands held him to safety. They lay in the snow, breathing hard. Margaret was crying, not the delicate tears of a lady, but raw, frightened sobs. Without thinking, Jake put his arm around her, and she didn't pull away. "You're safe," he said. "It's over." She looked up at him, snow in her dark hair, her green eyes swimming with tears. "You saved me. After everything, why?" Jake helped her to her feet, because it was the right thing to do. He started to turn away, but her hand on his arm stopped him. "Mr. Sullivan." Jake, But whatever she was going to say was lost as Richard Whitmore arrived in a flurry of activity, wrapping his sister in blankets and leading her to a waiting carriage. Jake watched them go, confused by the turmoil in his chest. "That was brave, what you did," Tom said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Especially considering." "Yeah, well," Jake retrieved his rope, trying to ignore the memory of Margaret's hand gripping his arm, the vulnerability in her eyes. "Don't expect it to change anything." But as he walked home through the falling snow, Jake wondered if it already had. The woman he'd saved tonight wasn't the cruel lady who'd mocked him. She was someone else entirely, someone human, frightened, and surprisingly strong. Back in town, word of the rescue spread quickly. By morning, everyone would know that Jake Sullivan had risked his life to save the woman who'd been trying to destroy him. What that would mean for their strange war, Jake couldn't guess, but he had a feeling the battle lines had just become a lot less clear. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Jake's door. Danny answered it, then called out in surprise, "Jake, you'll want to see this." Jake emerged from the bedroom to find a well-dressed servant standing in their modest cabin, looking distinctly uncomfortable. The man held an envelope sealed with the Whitmore crest. "Mr. Sullivan," the servant said stiffly, "Lady Whitmore requests your presence at Whitmore Hall this afternoon at 2 o'clock. Jake took the envelope, breaking the seal to find an elegantly penned note. Asterisk, "Mr. Sullivan, your heroic actions yesterday demand proper acknowledgement. I would be honored if you would join me for tea this afternoon. M. Whitmore, asterisk. Tell Lady Whitmore," Jake began, ready to refuse. "Jake," Danny interrupted quietly. "Maybe you should go." Jake looked at his brother in surprise. Danny's face was pinched with worry. They were down to their last few dollars, and winter was closing in fast. "I'll consider it," Jake told the servant, who departed with obvious relief. After the man left, Jake turned to Danny. "You can't be serious." "Why not?" Danny challenged. "You saved her life. Maybe she's ready to call off this war. Or maybe she wants to humiliate me in her own home. And maybe," Danny said firmly, "you're too proud for your own good. And mine." The words stung because they held truth. Jake's pride had cost them both. That afternoon, Jake stood before the massive oak doors of Whitmore Hall, feeling out of place in his only good shirt and clean pants. The mansion sprawled before him like something from a fairy tale, 3 stories of imported stone and glass, surrounded by manicured gardens now dressed in autumn colors. A butler answered his knock, his expression carefully neutral as he took in Jake's appearance. "Mr. Sullivan, Lady Whitmore is expecting you in the blue parlor." Jake followed the man through hallways lined with paintings and Persian rugs that probably cost more than he'd make in a lifetime. The blue parlor proved to be an intimate room overlooking the mountains, decorated in shades of sapphire and cream. Margaret sat by the window, and Jake almost didn't recognize her, gone with the elaborate dresses and heavy jewelry. She wore a simple green day dress that brought out her eyes, and her dark hair was pulled back in a modest style. She looked younger, softer, and surprisingly lovely. "Mr. Sullivan." She rose as he entered, a gesture of respect that surprised him. "Thank you for coming, Lady Whitmore." He remained standing, uncertain. "Please, sit." She gestured to a chair across from her. "I've had tea prepared, though I suspect you might prefer coffee." "Coffee would be fine." He sat carefully on the delicate chair, feeling like a bull in a china shop. They sat in awkward silence, while a maid served coffee and an array of small sandwiches and cakes Jake didn't recognize. When they were alone, Margaret cleared her throat. "Oh, you more than thanks," she began. "I owe you an apology. Several, actually." Jake set down his cup, surprised by her directness. "My behavior that day in town was inexcusable," she continued, her cheeks coloring. I had just come from a particularly difficult meeting about my father's estate. There are debts, you see. Significant ones. The family fortune isn't what people think, and the pressure has been." She stopped herself. "But that's no excuse for how I treated you." "No," Jake agreed quietly, "it's not." Margaret flinched but nodded. "You're right. And then to compound my shame by using my influence against you." She met his eyes. "I've instructed Richard to restore all your contracts and credit lines, with interest for the inconvenience. I don't want your charity." "It's not charity. It's..." Just as she paused, twisting her hands in her lap. "May I tell you something, Mr. Sullivan? Something I've told very few people." Jake nodded, intrigued despite himself. "I wasn't always large." The word seemed to pain her. "When I was young, I was quite slender. The belle of Boston society, they said. Then my mother died when I was 16. I dealt with grief by eating. Father sent me away to schools, to doctors, to cure me. Nothing worked. By the time I returned home, I had become what you saw that day, someone easy to mock, to dismiss." Jake shifted uncomfortably, beginning to understand. "When I saw you that day," Margaret continued, "strong and handsome and confident, surrounded by friends, I envied you. And when I smelled the honest work on you, it reminded me of my father in his younger days, before society softened him, before the debts and the drinking." And she stopped again, composing herself. "I lashed out at you because you represented everything I'd lost. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just hoping for understanding." Jake studied her face, seeing past the carefully maintained exterior to the pain beneath. "We all carry our wounds differently," he said finally. "I grew up with nothing, built everything I have with these hands. When you mocked me for that, it cut deep. I know. I saw it in your face, and I was glad. I wanted someone else to hurt the way I hurt every day." Tears gathered in her eyes. "What kind of person does that make me?" "A human one," Jake said, surprising them both. Margaret smiled through her tears, a real smile. Not the practiced society version. It transformed her face, revealing the beauty that her bitterness had hidden. "You're kinder than I deserve, Mr. Sullivan." "Jake," he said, "if we're starting over, you should call me Jake. Then you must call me Margaret." She hesitated. "Are we starting over?" Jake considered. Every practical bone in his body said yes, except her apology, take the restored contracts, and get on with life. But something deeper stirred, a curiosity about this complex woman, who is nothing like he'd assumed. "I'd like that," he said. They spent the next hour in surprisingly easy conversation. Margaret asked about his work, showing genuine interest in the process of selecting and felling trees. Jake found himself describing the forest in ways he'd never articulated before. The personality of different trees, the satisfaction of a clean cut, the way morning light filtered through pine needles. In turn, Margaret spoke of her struggles managing the estate, the resistance from male business partners who saw her as an easy mark, the loneliness of being neither accepted by local society nor able to return to Boston. "Why can't you go back?" Jake asked. Margaret's smile was rueful. "A woman of my proportions and age. I'm 34, who has failed to marry. Boston would eat me alive. At least here, I have the armor of the Whitmore name. Seems like lonely armor." "It is." She looked at him with those startling green eyes. "May I ask you something personal?" Jake nodded. "Yesterday, when you saved me, you could have let me die. No one would have blamed you, given our history. Why didn't you?" Jake thought about it. "My mother used to say that hatred is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I was angry, but I didn't hate you. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I'm not sure I could live with myself if I'd let you fall. Your mother sounds wise. She died 5 years ago, but I still hear her voice sometimes." They sat in comfortable silence, the late afternoon sun painting the mountains gold outside the window. Jake realized with surprise that he was enjoying himself. Margaret was intelligent, witty when she let her guard down, and surprisingly, "I should go," he said finally, noticing the lengthening shadows. "Danny will wonder what's become of me. Your brother." At Jake's nod, she continued, "I heard about his accident. Is he well enough? The limp slows him down, but he's tougher than he looks." Margaret stood when he did, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming, Jake, and for everything." Jake took her hand, noticing how small and soft it felt in his calloused grip. "Thank you for the coffee. And the honesty." As he turned to leave, Margaret called out, "Jake, would you consider coming again? I so rarely have." Interesting conversation. He looked back at her, standing alone in that beautiful room, and saw not Lady Whitmore, but Margaret. Vulnerable, lonely, and brave enough to apologize to a man she'd wronged. "I'd like that," he said, and meant it. Walking home through the crisp October evening, Jake marveled at the day's turn. He'd expected continued warfare or cold formality. Instead, he'd found something entirely unexpected, a kindred spirit hidden beneath layers of silk and society manners. Margaret Whitmore was nothing like he'd imagined, and that realization both thrilled and terrified him. The war was over, but something new had begun. Jake wasn't sure what to call it yet, but he found himself looking forward to finding out. 2 weeks passed in a blur of unexpected changes. True to her word, Margaret had restored all of Jake's contracts, and the lumber camp was busier than ever. But the most surprising development was the friendship growing between the unlikely pair. Jake had returned to Whitmore Hall 3 times, each visit lasting longer than the last. They talked about books. Margaret was delighted to discover he was well-read despite his limited formal education. They debated politics, discussed philosophy, and shared stories of their vastly different childhoods. "You've never been to the ocean?" Margaret asked during his 4th visit, genuine astonishment in her voice. They were in the library this time, a massive room that had become Jake's favorite in the house. "Never had reason to go," Jake admitted, running his fingers along the spine of a leather-bound volume. "Furthest I've been is Denver." "Oh, Jake, you must see it someday. The way the waves crash against the rocks in Maine, the salt air, the endless horizon." She trailed off, lost in memory. "Maybe someday," he said, though they both knew a lumberjack's wages didn't stretch to leisure travel. Margaret changed the subject. Something Jake noticed she did whenever their different circumstances became too apparent. "I've been meaning to ask, would you teach me to ride?" Jake looked up in surprise. "You don't know how?" "I can sit a horse adequately for a lady's gentle ride," she said with a self-deprecating smile. "But real riding, father thought it unladylike, and in Boston, one simply takes carriages everywhere." "What made you want to learn now?" Margaret moved to the window, gazing out at the mountains. "Because I'm tired of being trapped by what others think I should be. A lady doesn't ride astride. A lady doesn't involve herself in business. A lady doesn't—" She turned to face him. "A lady doesn't befriend lumberjacks. Yet here we are." "Here we are," Jake agreed, warmth spreading through his chest. They arranged to meet the following morning at the Whitmore stables. Jake arrived to find Margaret waiting in a divided riding skirt that looked newly purchased, her face bright with anticipation. "I had Mrs. Morrison make this specially," she said, gesturing to the practical garment. She was scandalized. Jake grinned. "It suits you. Now, let's find you a proper horse." He bypassed the docile mares Margaret usually rode, stopping at a stall containing a spirited chestnut gelding. "This is Atlas. He's got energy but a good heart. Like someone else I—" "No." Margaret blushed prettily. "Are you comparing me to a horse? Jake Sullivan?" "Never," he said with mock solemnity. "I respect horses too much." She swatted his arm playfully, and Jake was struck by how comfortable they'd become with each other. The formal barriers had fallen away, leaving something warm and real. The riding lesson was a revelation. Margaret was a natural. Once she overcame her initial fear, Jake taught her to move with the horse, instead of simply sitting on it, to communicate through pressure and balance, rather than just reins. "Feel his rhythm," Jake instructed, jogging alongside as she trotted Atlas around the paddock. "Don't fight. It'd become part of it." Margaret's face glowed with exhilaration as she found her seat, moving in harmony with the horse. "This is wonderful. Why did no one teach me this before?" "Because proper ladies don't need to know," Jake said dryly. "Lucky for you, I don't know any proper ladies." She laughed, a rich, genuine sound that made his heart skip. "Indeed you don't." After an hour, they took a break, sitting on the paddock fence like children. Margaret's hair had come partially loose from its pins, curling around her flushed face. Jake thought she'd never looked more beautiful. "You're a good teacher," she said, slightly breathless, patient and encouraging. "Have you thought of doing more than lumber work?" Jake shrugged. "Trees are what I know. It's honest work, yes, but is it what you love?" The question caught him off guard. I've never really thought about it that way. It's what needed doing to survive." Margaret studied him with those penetrating green eyes. What would you do if money weren't a concern? If you could choose anything, Jake considered. I'd travel, I think. See those oceans you talk about. Maybe write about what I see. He laughed, embarrassed. Foolish dreams for a lumberjack. Not foolish at all. Margaret's voice was soft. You have a poet's soul, Jake Sullivan. I've seen it in how you describe the forest, heard it in your observations about books we've discussed. Their eyes met and held, something electric passing between them. Jake found himself leaning closer, drawn by a force he couldn't name. Margaret's lips parted slightly, her breath catching. Margaret, what in heaven's name are you doing? They sprang apart as Richard Whitmore strode toward them, his face thunderous. Margaret slid down from the fence, smoothing her skirts. Richard, I didn't expect you back from Denver until tomorrow. Clearly, his cold gaze swept from his sister's disheveled appearance to Jake's proximity. Mr. Sullivan, I believe your business here is concluded. Richard, Margaret protested. Jake is my guest. He's teaching me to ride. In that outfit, looking like a common farmhand. Richard's voice dripped disdain. Have you lost all sense of propriety? Jake stepped forward. Don't speak to her that way. Richard's eyes narrowed. And you'll what? Threaten me. I've tolerated this association out of gratitude for your saving Margaret's life. But I see now, it's gone too far. Richard, please, Margaret began. But her brother cut her off. Inside. Now we need to discuss this privately. He turned to Jake. You're no longer welcome at Whitmore Hall, Sullivan. Whatever hold you're trying to establish over my sister ends now. Hold. Jake's temper flared. You think I'm after her money, aren't you? Richard's smile was cruel. A penniless lumberjack, befriending a wealthy spinster. How convenient that must be. Jake took a step forward, fists clenched. But Margaret's hand on his arm stopped him. Don't, she said quietly. He's not worth it. Then louder. Richard, you're wrong about Jake. He's been nothing but naive sister. Richard interrupted. We'll discuss this inside. Mr. Sullivan, I trust you can see yourself out. Jake looked at Margaret, seeing the conflict in her eyes, the desire to defend him warring with years of submission to family authority. He made the choice for her. It's all right, he said gently. I'll go. Jake. Her voice was anguished. Thank you for the coffee and conversation, Lady Whitmore, he said formally. The title a barrier, thrown back up between them. I hope you enjoy your riding. He walked away without looking back, though he heard Margaret's raised voice arguing with her brother. His hands shook with suppressed rage, not at the accusation of gold digging, but at the sight of Margaret being bullied back into the cage she'd been trying to escape. That evening, Danny found Jake splitting wood with vicious intensity behind their cabin. Want to talk about it? Danny asked. Jake swung the axe, cleaving a log cleanly in two. Nothing to talk about. I was a fool to think anything could come of it. Come of what? Danny's voice was gentle. Jake, what's really going on between you and Margaret Whitmore? Jake paused, breathing hard. What was going on? He'd started visiting, out of curiosity, continued out of genuine enjoyment of her company. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. The way his heart raced when she smiled. The way her laugh made him feel like he could fly. The way he looked forward to their meetings more than anything else in his week. I don't know, he admitted, but it doesn't matter now. Richards made sure of that. Inside their cabin, a letter waited, delivered by a servant who'd fled before Jake could respond. Margaret's handwriting, hastily scrawled. Jake, I'm so sorry for Richard's behavior. Please don't let his words poison what we've built. You've become dear to me in ways I'm only beginning to understand. I'll find a way to make this right. Don't give up on me. Yours, Margaret. Jake read it 3 times, his heart twisting. Don't give up on me, she'd written. But as he looked around the shabby cabin, at his calloused hands and work-worn clothes, he wondered if Richard hadn't been right about one thing. What future could there be between a lumberjack and a lady? The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, and Jake made a decision. He wouldn't go back to Whitmore Hall. Not because of Richard's threats, but because he cared too much about Margaret to subject her to more family strife. Some chasms were simply too wide to cross, no matter how much 2 people might wish otherwise. But as he lay in bed that night, he couldn't forget the moment on the fence, the way she'd looked at him, the almost kiss that might have changed everything. In saving Margaret from the carriage that day, Jake realized he might have lost something else entirely. His heart. A week crawled by without word from Margaret. Jake threw himself into work, but everywhere he looked, he was reminded of her. The way morning light through pine needles, reminded him of her eyes. How the sound of a distant laugh made his heart leap, hoping impossibly it might be hers. Then came the announcement that set all of Silver Ridge buzzing. Margaret Whitmore was hosting a harvest ball, the first social event at Whitmore Hall since her father's death. The entire town was invited, an unprecedented gesture that had the gossips working overtime. She's never done anything like this before, Mary Chen mused, as Jake picked up supplies at the general store. Word is, she's even invited the miners, the ranch hands, everyone, not just the quality folk. Jake grunted non-committally, selecting nails with unnecessary focus. Mary wasn't fooled. You'll go, of course. Everyone knows you two became friends after the rescue. I wasn't invited, Jake said curtly. Jake Sullivan, the whole town was invited. That includes you. Mary studied him shrewdly. Unless there's a reason you're avoiding her. Before Jake could respond, Tom burst through the door. Jake, you need to see this. He thrust a piece of paper at Jake, an elegant invitation on cream cardstock. But it wasn't the general invitation. This was personal, addressed specifically to him, with a handwritten note at the bottom. Asterisk, please come. I have something important to tell you. Messenger said to make sure you got it personal like, Tom explained. So, we're going, right? Free food, music, and all those Denver society ladies Richard's been importing. Count me in. That Saturday night, Jake stood outside Whitmore Hall, tugging at the borrowed suit that didn't quite fit right. Danny had insisted he go, practically shoving him out the door. The mansion blazed with light, carriages arriving steadily to discharge guests in their finery. Coming in, or planning to admire the architecture all night. Jake turned to find Ben Cooper grinning at him, looking equally uncomfortable in his Sunday best. Just working up the nerve, Jake admitted. Come on, if Margaret Whitmore can invite the whole town to a fancy house, we can walk through her door. The ballroom was like something from a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light over swirling couples, while musicians played from a raised platform. Jake had never seen such opulence. Silk-draped walls, towers of food, champagne flowing like water, but his eyes found only Margaret. She stood near the orchestra, wearing a deep blue gown that made her skin glow like porcelain. Her hair was swept up in an elegant style, diamonds glittering at her throat. She was surrounded by people, playing the perfect hostess, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes kept scanning the crowd. Then she saw him. Her face lit up with such joy that Jake's breath caught. She excused herself from her companions and moved toward him. Society be damned. You came, she breathed, reaching for his hands before catching herself. I was afraid. After Richard, your note said it was important. Yes. She glanced around, then leaned closer. But not here. Meet me in the library in an hour. There's something I must tell you privately. Before Jake could respond, Richard appeared at his sister's elbow. Margaret, the Denver guests are asking for you. His cold gaze found Jake. Mr. Sullivan, how unexpected. I invited him, Margaret said firmly, as I invited everyone. Yes, your egalitarian experiment. Richard's smile was thin. How modern of you. Come, sister, duty calls. He led Margaret away, but she looked back at Jake, mouthing 1 hour. Jake spent the time nursing a single glass of champagne and dodging the curious stares of other guests. He could hear the whispers. What was the lumber camp worker doing here? Why had Margaret Whitmore really invited the whole town? Was it true they'd become friends? Finally, the hour passed. Jake slipped away from the ballroom, making his way to the library. Margaret was already there, standing by the window in the moonlight. She turned as he entered, and he saw tears on her cheeks. What's wrong? He moved toward her instinctively. Everything. Nothing. She laughed shakily. I'm leaving Silver Ridge. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. What, Richards? Arranged it. A position with our aunt in San Francisco. He says it's for my own good, that I've become too unconventional, that my friendship with you has compromised my reputation. She met his eyes. He's selling the estate. He can't do that. It's yours. No, it's ours. And he controls the business interests. Without his cooperation, I can't maintain the house anyway. She moved closer. Jake, I need you to know something before I go. Margaret, please, let me speak. She took a breath. That day in town, when I mocked you, it was the worst day of my life, not because of the carriage accident, but because I saw myself clearly for the first time. I saw what I'd become. Bitter, cruel, everything I despised in others. You've apologized, We've moved past it, have we? She stepped closer, still, close enough that he could smell her perfume, see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. Because I haven't moved past anything. These weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. You see me, Jake, not Lady Whitmore, not the overweight spinster, not the family embarrassment, just me. Jake's heart pounded. Margaret, I'm in love with you. The words hung between them like stars. I know it's impossible. I know a dozen reasons why it could never work, but I couldn't leave without telling you. Jake stared at her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, the courage it took to speak those words. In that moment, all the barriers, class, money, society, fell away, leaving only truth. It's not impossible, he said roughly, because I love you too. Margaret's sob was half joy, half anguish. Don't say that unless Jake silenced her by pulling her into his arms and kissing her. It was a kiss that held weeks of longing, of connection found in unlikely places, of two souls recognizing each other despite every odd against them. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Come away with me, Jake said urgently. We'll go somewhere new, start fresh. I'll find work, we'll build a life, Jake. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. You have Danny to think of. Your life is here, and I won't be the reason you give up everything. You're not asking me to. No, but that's what would happen. You'd resent me eventually, and I'd hate myself for it. She touched his face tenderly. I leave in 3 days. Richard's made sure of that. But I wanted one perfect moment to remember. Thank you for giving me that. This isn't goodbye, Jake said fiercely. I won't let it be. Margaret smiled sadly. My brave lumberjack, always trying to save me. She kissed him once more, softly. But some things can't be saved. The library door opened, and Richard stood silhouetted against the light from the hall. Margaret, our guests are wondering where their hostess has gone. Margaret stepped away from Jake, transforming back into Lady Whitmore, as if donning armor. Of course, I was just thanking Mr. Sullivan for attending. She swept past her brother without another glance at Jake, leaving him standing alone. In the moonlight, Richard lingered, his expression triumphant. 3 days, Sullivan. After that, you'll never see her again. I'll make certain of it. Jake said nothing, his hands clenched at his sides. Richard left, and Jake stood in the library, where he'd spent so many happy hours with Margaret, feeling as if his heart had been ripped from his chest. 3 days. 3 days to accept that the woman he loved would disappear from his life forever. 3 days to figure out how to live with that dot. As he left Whitmore Hall, the sounds of music and laughter mocking him, Jake made a decision. Richard Whitmore might think he'd won, but Jake Sullivan had never given up on anything in his life. He wasn't about to start now. The morning after the ball, Jake stood in the pre-dawn darkness outside Whitmore Hall. He'd spent a sleepless night forming a plan, perhaps foolish, definitely desperate, but the only chance he had. The servants would be stirring soon, and he needed to intercept Margaret's personal maid. His patience was rewarded when Sarah McCower, a young woman he'd spoken with during his visits, emerged from the servants' entrance carrying a water bucket. Sarah, he called softly. She startled, then recognized him. Mr. Sullivan, what are you doing here at this hour? I need to see Margaret. It's urgent. Sarah glanced nervously at the house. Mr. Richard left strict instructions. You're not to be admitted. I'm not asking to come in. Just can you give her this? Jake pressed the letter into Sarah's hands. Please, it's important. Sarah studied his face, then nodded. I'll try, but Mr. Richard watches her like a hawk now. Jake waited in town, pacing outside the general store, until Mary Chen took pity on him and opened early. He was nursing his 3rd cup of coffee when Tom rushed in. Jake, there's been an accident at the mine cabin. They need every available man. Jake's personal troubles fled in the face of crisis. He joined the rescue efforts, spending the next 18 hours helping dig out trapped miners. It was dangerous work, but by nightfall, they'd saved 7 men who otherwise would have died, exhausted and filthy. Jake finally returned home to find Margaret waiting on his doorstep. Margaret, he blinked, wondering if exhaustion was making him hallucinate. How Sarah gave me your letter. She stood, and he saw she wore a simple traveling dress. I slipped out while Richard was dealing with business related to the mine accident. We don't have long. Jake unlocked the door, acutely aware of his appearance, covered in rock, dust, and sweat, clothes torn from the rescue work. I'm sorry, I'm a mess. There was a cavern, I know. Tom Bradley's wife told me. She said you led the rescue effort. Margaret's eyes shone with pride and something else. You saved those men. Anyone would have. No. She stepped closer. Not anyone. You. The man who saved me. Who saves others. Who sees the best in people even when they show him their worst. Her voice broke. The man I'm being forced to leave. Jake caught her hands. Then don't leave. Stay. Fight for what you want. With what? Margaret laughed bitterly. I have no money of my own. The house, the accounts, everything is tied up in Father's estate, which Richard controls. I'm 34 years old, Jake, and I own nothing but the clothes on my back, and some jewelry. Then we'll manage with that. I don't care about money, but I care about being a burden. Margaret pulled away. I won't come to you empty-handed, dependent on your charity. I've seen what that does to a marriage. My mother spent her last years feeling like a beggar in her own home, because she brought no fortune to the match. Jake ran his hands through his dusty hair, frustration building. So what was in my letter? Why did you come? Margaret's expression softened. You asked for one day. One perfect day before I leave. How could I refuse? Tomorrow. Tomorrow. Richard thinks I'm visiting the Hendersons to say goodbye. We'll have from sunrise to sunset. Jake wanted to argue, to rage against the unfairness of it all, but looking at Margaret's determined face, he knew this was all she could give. One day would have to be enough. All right, he said quietly. One day, they made their plans, a picnic in the mountains. Far from prying eyes and society's judgment, Margaret would bring food. Jake would bring horses and his knowledge of the hidden places where they could be alone. After she left, Danny emerged from his room where he'd been giving them privacy. You're just going to let her go. What choice do I have? Jake slumped in a chair. Force her to choose between love and security. Watch her grow to resent me when times get hard. Danny was quiet for a moment. You know, Jake, sometimes people are worth the risk. Sometimes love is enough, is it? Jake looked at his younger brother. Was love enough for Pa when Ma died birthing me? Was it enough when he drank himself to death from grief, leaving you to raise me? That was different, was it? He loved her so much that losing her destroyed him. And what he had with her was sanctioned by society, blessed by the church. What Margaret and I have. Jake shook his head. Maybe one perfect day is more than we deserve. That night, Jake cleaned his best clothes and polished his boots. If he was only getting one day with the woman he loved, he'd make it count. But as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was giving up to Isley. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. A man's character isn't measured by how he treats his friends, but how he treats his enemies. But what about how he fought for love? What did it say about his character if he let Margaret go without exhausting every possibility? The question haunted him as sleep finally came, bringing dreams of green eyes and autumn leaves and a happiness that seemed always just out of reach. Tomorrow would be their day, but Jake was beginning to think one day would never be enough. Dawn came painted in shades of rose and gold. Perfect weather for heartbreak. Jake had the horses saddled and waiting when Margaret arrived. Her face glowing with anticipation, despite the sorrow lurking in her eyes. Where are we going? She asked, as Jake helped her mount Atlas, the chestnut gelding she'd learned to ride. You'll see. He swung up onto his own horse, a steady mare named Belle. Trust me. Always, Margaret said simply, and Jake's heart clenched. They rode out of town as the sun climbed higher, following trails Jake knew from years of working the mountain forests. The autumn aspens shimmered like coins, their leaves whispering secrets as the horses passed. Jake led them higher, through hidden valleys and along crystal streams, until they reached a meadow he'd discovered years ago. Oh, Jake. Margaret's breath caught. It's beautiful. The meadow spread before them like a golden bowl, surrounded by peaks already dusted with snow. A small lake reflected the sky, its surface mirror smooth. Wildflowers still bloomed in protected spots, defiant splashes of purple and yellow against the dying grass. I used to come here when I needed to think, Jake said, dismounting. Never brought anyone else before. They spread a blanket near the lake, and Margaret unpacked the feast she'd brought. Cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, and apple tart, but neither had much appetite. They sat close together, shoulders touching, trying to memorize every moment. Tell me about San Francisco, Jake said finally. I don't want to talk about San Francisco. Margaret turned to face him. Tell me about your mother. You've mentioned her, but never the whole story. So Jake told her about Mary Sullivan, the schoolteacher from Ireland who'd married a mining man and never complained about their poverty. How she'd taught Jake to read by firelight, insisted on proper grammar, even when the other miners' kids teased him for talking fancy. How she'd died of fever when he was 15, but not before making him promise to be more than just his father's son. She would have liked you, Jake said. She always said the measure of a person wasn't what they had, but what they did with it. I would have liked her too. Margaret was quiet for a moment. My mother was different. She was beautiful, accomplished, everything a society wife should be. But she was desperately unhappy. Father was gone on business constantly, and she faded, like a flower without sun. When she died, I think part of her was relieved. Is that why you fight so hard? To not fade? Margaret considered this. Perhaps, or perhaps, I fight because I'm afraid if I stop, I'll discover I'm just like her underneath. Beautiful on the outside, empty within. You're not empty. Jake took her hand. You're the most alive person I've ever met. Your mind, your spirit, your heart, they shine so bright sometimes I can barely look at you. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. How am I supposed to leave you when you say things like that? Then don't. The words burst out of him. Margaret, I've been thinking. What if we didn't wait? What if we married today? Right now. There's a justice of the peace in Silver Ridge. Richard couldn't force you to leave if you were my wife. Margaret pulled her hand away. And then what? We live in your cabin on your wages while Richard ensures no decent family will receive us. I become the lady who married beneath her, and you become the fortune hunter who trapped an heiress. I don't care what people say, but I do. Margaret stood, pacing to the lake's edge. Not for my sake, but for yours. For Danny. For our children, if we had them. You think I don't know what people whisper about me now? The fat spinster, desperate enough to chase after a lumberjack. I won't have them saying you married me for money, or that I bought myself a husband. Jake followed her, anger building. So pride is more important than love. It's not pride. Margaret whirled to face him. It's protection. Jake, I've seen what happens when love isn't enough. My parents had love once, but years of financial strain, social isolation, disappointed hopes, it poisoned everything. By the end, they could barely stand to be in the same room. We're not them. No, we're worse. At least they started on equal footing. Margaret's voice was anguished. Jake, in your world, you're respected, accomplished. In mine, you'd be nothing. And eventually, you'd hate me for it. Jake grabbed her shoulders. You're wrong. I could never hate you. My father said the same thing to my mother. They stood frozen, breathing hard, the weight of impossible choices crushing them both. Then Margaret made a soft sound, half sob, half surrender, and kissed him. It was different from their first kiss. That had been discovery and hope. This was farewell, desperate and fierce. They clung to each other by the lake, trying to pour a lifetime of love into a single moment. When they broke apart, both had tears on their faces. I have something for you, Margaret said shakily. She pulled a small leather pouch from her pocket. My mother's ring. The only thing of value. That's truly mine. Jake opened the pouch to find a simple gold band set with a small emerald. Margaret, I can't, please. I need to know some part of me stays with you. She closed his fingers around the ring. Sell it if you need to. Use it to travel, to see those oceans we talked about. Just remember me when you do. As if I could forget. Jake pulled her close. Again. Margaret, this isn't right. There has to be another way. Sometimes there isn't. She buried her face in his chest. Sometimes love means letting go. They stayed by the lake until the sun began its descent. Talking, touching, trying to stretch the hours. Margaret told him about her favorite places in Boston. Jake described the different seasons in the mountains. They made promises they both knew they couldn't keep. To write. To wait. To somehow find their way back to each other. As they rode back toward town in the gathering dusk, Jake felt like a man heading to his own execution. Every hoofbeat brought them closer to goodbye. At the edge of town, Margaret pulled up. I'll go on alone from here. Richard mustn't know. Margaret, no. She held up a hand. If you say anything else, I won't have the strength to leave. She looked at him one last time, memorizing his face. Thank you for today. For everything. For showing me who I could be. Margaret, please. But she was already riding away. Her back straight, not looking back. Jake sat on his horse, watching until she disappeared around a bend. The ring burned in his pocket like a coal. He returned home to find Danny waiting anxiously. Well, did you convince her to stay? Jake shook his head, unable to speak. Danny studied his brother's face. Then quietly made coffee, while Jake sat at their small table, staring at nothing. Finally, Jake pulled out the ring, holding it up to the lamplight. She gave me this, her mother's ring. Told me to sell it, use the money to travel. Will you? Jake closed his fist around the ring. No, never. He looked at Danny. I'm going to earn the right to put this on her finger properly. However long it takes, whatever I have to do. I'm going to become the kind of man who can marry Margaret Whitmore without anyone saying she settled for less. Danny smiled sadly. And if she's already gone by then? Married to someone else? Jake's jaw set with determination. Then at least, I'll know I tried. That I didn't just let her go, because it was easier than fighting. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere across town, Margaret was preparing for her journey to San Francisco. But Jake Sullivan was already planning his own journey. One that would transform him from a simple lumberjack into a man worthy of a lady's hand. The war between pride and love was far from over. Margaret's departure day dawned gray and drizzling, as if the sky itself mourned. Jake stood across from the stage depot, hidden in the shadows of Murphy's saloon, watching the loading of trunks and cases. He'd promised himself he wouldn't come, but his feet had carried him here anyway. She emerged from the Whitmore carriage, dressed in traveling clothes, her face pale, but composed. Richard fussed around her, clearly eager to see her gone. Jake's hands clenched as he watched Richard kiss his sister's cheek, a Judas kiss if ever there was one. Then, as if drawn by his gaze, Margaret looked directly at where Jake stood. Their eyes met across the muddy street, and for a moment, time stopped. Jake saw her lips form his name, saw her take a half-step toward him, but Richard's hand on her elbow steered her firmly toward the stage. All aboard for Denver, and points west. The driver called. Jake watched her climb inside, watched the door close, watched the stage pull away. He stood in the rain long after it disappeared, until Tom found him and dragged him into the saloon. Drink, Tom ordered, pouring whiskey. Then we plan. Plan what? Jake asked dully. How you're going to win her back, of course. Tom signaled the others, Will, Charlie, Ben. They gathered around Jake, like generals planning a campaign. First things first, Ben said practically. You need money. Real money, not lumber wages. The Henderson Ranch needs hands for the cattle drive to Kansas, Will suggested. Pays good if you survive. Or the railroad, Charlie added. They're hiring crew bosses for the mountain section. Dangerous work, but the bonuses are substantial. Jake stared at his friends. You'd all help me. Help you. Tom snorted. Jake, you've pulled every one of us out of trouble more times than we can count. Besides, watching you and Lady Margaret dance around each other these past weeks has been better than a penny novel. We're invested in the outcome now. Despite his pain, Jake felt warmth kindle in his chest. These men were his true brothers, worth more than any social standing. All right, he said slowly. But I need more than money. I need education, connections, respectability. The kind of things that can't be bought. Leave that to me, said Anne's unexpected voice. Mary Chen had approached their table. My cousin in Denver runs a finishing school for young ladies. But she also tutors privately. Deportment, etiquette, social graces. If you're serious about transforming yourself, she can help. Jake looked around the table at these people who believed in him, who saw something in him worth fighting for. I'm serious. More serious than I've ever been about anything. Then we start tomorrow, Ben declared. The cattle drive leaves in 3 days. That's 4 months of hard earning. By the time you get back, we'll have the next step planned. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Jake arranged for Danny's care, ensuring his brother had enough money and support. Danny, for his part, was fiercely supportive. Go, he said firmly. I managed before you were born. I can manage while you're gone. Just come back as the man Margaret deserves. The morning Jake left with the cattle drive, he stopped at the cemetery where his mother was buried. He placed wildflowers on her grave, and made a silent promise he would become the man she'd always believed he could be. The drive to Kansas was brutal. For months of dust, stampedes, river crossings, and storms, Jake threw himself into the work with single-minded determination, earning the respect of hardened cowboys and the trust of the trail boss. When bandits attacked near the Oklahoma border, Jake's quick thinking saved half the herd and earned him a substantial bonus. He returned to Silver Ridge in late spring, lean and hardened, with more money than he'd ever possessed. But money was just the beginning. Mary Chen's cousin, Mrs. Liu, proved to be a formidable ally. She took one look at Jake and declared, "We have work to do." For the next 6 months, Jake split his time between lumber work and transformation. Mrs. Liu taught him which fork to use at formal dinners, how to dance properly, how to make small talk about art and music. She corrected his grammar relentlessly, expanded his vocabulary, and introduced him to the classics of literature he'd missed. "You have good instincts," she told him one evening, as they practiced formal introductions. "You're naturally courteous, and you listen well. Those qualities matter more than blood or breeding." Jake also took on extra work wherever he could find it. He helped the town banker with his books, learning about finance and investment. He assisted the lawyer with research, absorbing legal principles. Every skill, every piece of knowledge, was another step toward becoming worthy of Margaret. Letters from San Francisco were rare and precious. Margaret wrote carefully, telling him about her aunt's house, the ocean views, the social world she was expected to join. Between the lines, Jake read her loneliness, her longing for the mountains and meaningful work. "I attended a ball last week," she wrote. The gentlemen were very attentive, especially a Mr. Pemberton, who owns several factories, and says he would be a good match. He is kind enough, I suppose. He doesn't make me laugh like you did. He doesn't challenge my mind or see past my surface. But perhaps that's for the best. Perhaps it's easier to marry where the heart isn't engaged." Jake wrote back immediately, "Don't settle, please. Give me time." Her response came a month later. "Time for what, my dear Jake? Time changes, nothing fundamental. You are still you, I am still me, and the world is still what it is. But for what it's worth, I've told Mr. Pemberton I need time to consider. Aunt is furious. I find I don't care." Fall arrived again, marking a year since Margaret's departure. Jake had saved enough to make a real investment. And Ben had an opportunity. A small logging operation was for sale, the owner retiring. With Jake's savings and a loan from a Denver bank negotiated with his new financial knowledge, he bought it. "Sullivan Lumber Company," Tom said, admiring the freshly painted sign. "Has a nice ring to it." Jake hired his friends, implemented new techniques he'd researched, and soon had contracts with the railroad. The business grew steadily, and with it, Jake's reputation. He was no longer just a lumberjack. He was a businessman, an employer, a man of growing substance. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. One evening, as snow began to fall, Jake sat in his office. He had an office now, in a proper building on Main Street, writing to Margaret. He told her about the business, about his studies, about the life he was building. But mostly, he wrote about how much he missed her. "I dream about that day at the lake. I hear your laugh in the wind through the pines. I see your eyes in every green thing. I'm becoming someone new, Margaret, but the heart of me remains unchanged. I love you. I will always love you. Please don't give up on us." He sealed the letter and stared out at the falling snow. 1 year down. How many more before he could claim the woman he loved? However many it took. Jake decided he'd promised to earn the right to offer her his mother's ring. Jake Sullivan always kept his promises. 2 years. That's how long it had been since Margaret had vanished into the western horizon, and Jake had begun his transformation. The man who stood in the Denver hotel, adjusting his perfectly tailored suit, bore little resemblance to the rough lumberjack who'd once been mocked for smelling of horses. Sullivan. Lumber had expanded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Jake now owned 3 mills, employed 50 men, and had contracts with railroads across the territory. But success had come at a price. Months of 18-hour days, risky investments that kept him awake at night, and the constant ache of Margaret's absence. "You clean up nice," Tom said, entering Jake's hotel room. As Jake's business manager now, Tom had traded his lumber clothes for proper suits, though he still looked uncomfortable in them. "You sure about tonight?" "Tonight? The governor's ball in Denver, where the territory's elite would gather. Where, according to Jake's carefully cultivated sources, Richard Whitmore would be in attendance with potential investors for a new mining venture, I'm sure," Jake said, checking his pocket watch, a gold piece that had replaced his father's battered silver one. "Any word from San Francisco?" Tom's face grew troubled. "Charlie's telegram arrived this morning. Jake, you need to prepare yourself. Charlie says she's engaged. That Pemberton fellow finally wore her down." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He gripped the bedpost, knuckles white. When the announcement was in yesterday's papers. Wedding set for Christmas. 3 months. After all his work, all his transformation, he was going to lose her to a factory owner with soft hands and no soul. "Maybe we should skip the ball," Tom suggested gently. "Head home, Regroup. No. Jake's voice was steel. We go tonight as planned. If I'm going to lose her, at least Richard Whitmore will know what kind of man his sister is giving up. The ballroom at the Windsor Hotel glittered with Denver's finest. Jake entered, with the confidence born of 2 years of practice, acknowledging greetings from business associates, exchanging pleasantries with their wives. He'd learned this dance, even if he'd never love it. My God, a familiar voice said behind him. Jake Sullivan. Jake turned to find Richard Whitmore staring at him in shock. Margaret's brother had aged in 2 years, his face lined with stress, his hair showing gray. Mr. Whitmore. Jake inclined his head politely. How pleasant to see you again. But how? You're successful, Jake suggested mildly. Yes, business has been good. I understand you're seeking investors for a mining venture. I might be interested, depending on the terms. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Around them, Jake noticed people watching with interest. The lumber baron and the mining heir. An intriguing combination. That is, Richard collected himself with visible effort. I hadn't heard you were in Denver. I maintain a residence here now. Necessary for business. Jake accepted champagne from a passing waiter, every gesture smooth and practiced. How is your sister? I heard. Congratulations are in order. Richard's eyes narrowed, searching for mockery, finding only polite interest. Yes, Pemberton is suitable. I'm glad she's found happiness. Jake lied smoothly. She deserves it. Before Richard could respond, the territorial governor approached. Sullivan. Just the man I wanted to see. Have you met Whitmore here? Richard, you should talk to Sullivan about your mining project. He has the best business instincts in the territory. Jake spent the next hour watching Richard squirm as Person. After Person praised Jake's acumen, his reliability, his rapid rise. It should have felt satisfying. Instead, it felt hollow. What good was proving himself to Richard when Margaret was engaged to another man? As the evening wore on, Jake found himself on the terrace, seeking air. The Denver lights spread below, like fallen stars, but all he could think about was San Francisco, where Margaret was probably choosing wedding flowers and pretending to be happy. Impressive performance. Jake turned to find Richard had followed him outside. No performance, Jake said. This is who I am now. Is it? Richard studied him with shrewd eyes. The clothes are better, the manners polished, but underneath, still, the same man who presumed to court my sister. The same man who loved your sister, Jake corrected. Who loves her still. Richard's face darkened. Then you're a fool. She's engaged to a man she doesn't love, in a life that will suffocate her. Jake set down his champagne glass carefully. Tell me something, Whitmore. Are you happy, knowing you've broken your sister's spirit? Forced her into a marriage of convenience. I've ensured her security. You've ensured your own comfort. Jake's careful control finally cracked. You sold the estate, scattered the servants who were like family to her, isolated her from everyone who cared about her. And why? Because she dared to see worth in someone you considered beneath her. Because she was making a fool of herself. Richard burst out. A Whitmore, chasing after a common laborer. A common laborer who now has 3 times your net worth. Jake interrupted coldly. Who rebuilt himself from nothing, while you've squandered your inheritance on failed ventures. Tell me, Richard, who's the fool? Richard went white. How dare you? I dare because I have nothing left to lose. Jake stepped closer. Margaret is marrying another man. My transformation means nothing if she's lost to me. So yes, I dare to speak truth to you, because someone should. You think your money changes what you are. Richard snarled. You're still the dirty lumberjack who stank of horses. Margaret's forgotten you. She never mentions your name. Never asks about Silver Ridge. Whatever fantasy you've built about winning her back, forget it. She's moved on. The words cut deep, but Jake saw something in Richard's eyes, fear. Why would Richard fear him if Margaret had truly forgotten? Has she? Jake asked softly. Then why are you here, talking to me instead of courting investors? Inside, why do you look like a man who's seen a ghost? Richard's composure cracked. Stay away from her. I'm warning you. Or what? Jake laughed bitterly. You'll ruin my business. I'm beyond your reach now, Whitmore. You'll poison Margaret against me. You already did that. You'll keep us apart. The Pacific Ocean is doing that quite effectively. Then what do you want? Jake looked at the man who'd helped destroy his happiness. I want you to know that you failed. You tried to break me, and instead, you forged me into someone stronger. You tried to prove I wasn't good enough for Margaret, and instead proved that you weren't good enough to be her brother. I want you to live with that knowledge. He turned to leave, then paused, and Richard, when Margaret's marriage makes her miserable, and it will remember that you had the chance to let her choose happiness. Remember that you're the one who took it away. Jake left Richard on the terrace and made his way through the ballroom, saying proper farewells, playing the successful businessman to the end. But inside, his heart was breaking all over again. In his hotel room, he pulled out Margaret's mother's ring, which he always carried. 2 years of work, of transformation, of hope, and he was too late. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he whispered to the ring. "I wasn't fast enough." Tomorrow, he'd return to Silver Ridge. He'd run his business, take care of Danny, live the life he'd built. But tonight, he mourned the future that might have been a future, where he could have placed this ring on Margaret's finger and called her his wife. The lumberjack had become a gentleman, but the lady was beyond his reach. Or so he thought. The telegram arrived on a cold November morning. 3 weeks after the Denver ball, Jake was reviewing contracts in his office when Tom burst in, breathless from running. "Jake," he thrust the yellow paper at his friend. "It's from Charlie in San Francisco." Jake's hands trembled as he read, Margaret called off. Engagement stop. Pemberton scandal broke. Stop sending details by letter. Stop, there is hope. Stop, Charlie. Jake. Read it 3 times before the words sank in. She called it off. "There's more," Tom said, grinning. "Mary Chen just got a letter from her cousin in San Francisco. Apparently, this Pemberton fellow was already married wife in Boston. He conveniently forgot to mention. Margaret discovered it 2 days before they were to send wedding invitations." Jake sank into his chair, heart pounding. Margaret was free. But what did that mean? Had the broken engagement damaged her reputation? Was she all right? "What do I do?" Jake asked, looking at Tom with lost eyes. "Do I write? Do I go to her?" "You wait for Charlie's letter," Tom advised. "Get all the information first. Then you make your move." The letter arrived 5 agonizing days later. Charlie's scrawled handwriting told the whole sordid story. Jake, you should see the newspapers here. Biggest scandal in years. Pemberton wife showed up at a party, very pregnant and very angry. Turns out he married her 3 years ago, then left her in Boston when he came west. He'd been courting Margaret as his ticket to respectability and her aunt's connections. Margaret handled it like the lady she is, returned his ring publicly, and told him exactly what she thought of men who abandoned their wives. Her aunt is mortified, but Margaret seems relieved. Overheard her tell a friend she'd rather die a spinster than marry without love. She's lost weight. Jake looks tired. Her aunt keeps pushing other suitors, but Margaret refuses them all. She spends most of her time working with a charity for sailors' widows, teaching their children to read. I think she's waiting for something, or someone. Charlie * Jake stood abruptly. "Tom, I need you to manage things. Here, I'm going to San Francisco." Finally, Tom grinned. "What's your plan?" Jake pulled out the ring he'd carried for 2 years. "I'm going to ask Margaret Whitmore to marry me. Properly this time. No more waiting. No more obstacles. Just truth." He left that afternoon, taking the train to Sacramento, then the riverboat to San Francisco. During the journey, he rehearsed a dozen speeches, discarded them all. How did you tell someone you'd rebuilt your entire life for them? How did you ask them to take a chance on a love that had survived separation, transformation, and scandal? San Francisco overwhelmed him with its noise and energy. The city clung to its hills like a defiant dream, fog rolling in from the bay to soften its rough edges. Jake found lodging at a respectable hotel and spent an evening gathering intelligence. Margaret's aunt lived on Nob Hill, of course, in a mansion that rivaled Whitmore Hall. The next morning, Jake, dressed in his best suit, had his shoes shined to a mirror gleam, and took a carriage up the impossibly steep streets. His heart hammered as he approached the door. A stern butler answered. "Yes, Jake Sullivan, to see Miss Margaret Whitmore." The butler's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is Miss Whitmore expecting you?" "No, but please tell her I've come a very long way to see her." The butler left him cooling his heels in an opulent parlor for 20 minutes. Jake was beginning to think he'd been forgotten when he heard footsteps on the stairs. A particular rhythm he'd know anywhere. Margaret appeared in the doorway, and Jake's breath caught. Charlie was right, she had lost weight, her face showing elegant bones that had been hidden before. She wore a simple blue morning dress, her hair in a modest style, but her green eyes were exactly as he remembered, widening now with shock. "Jake," her voice was barely a whisper. "Is it really you?" He stood slowly, drinking in the sight of her. "Hello, Margaret. But how? What are you doing here? I heard about Pemberton. I came to see if you were all right. Margaret laughed shakily. All right, I've been publicly humiliated, socially ruined, and my aunt hasn't spoken to me in a week, except to list my failures. I'm spectacular. You're beautiful, Jake said simply. Margaret's composure cracked. Don't, please. I can't bear kindness right now. Then I'll be direct. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring. You gave this to me 2 years ago. Told me to sell it, use it to travel. I kept it instead, as a promise. A promise that someday I'd be worthy to give it back to you. Margaret stared at the ring, tears gathering in her eyes. Jake, I'm not the man you left in Silver Ridge, he continued, moving closer. I own a lumber company now, 3 mills, contracts across the territory. I've studied, learned, transformed myself into someone who can stand in your world without shame. But my heart, that hasn't changed. I still love you, Margaret. I've loved you every day we've been apart. Stop, Margaret said brokenly. You don't understand. The scandal with Pemberton means nothing to me. My reputation is ruined. Then we'll build a new one together. I'm 36 years old. Jake, a failed spinster, who couldn't even recognize a fortune hunter. Jake silenced her by pulling her into his arms. You're the woman who saw worth in a dirty lumberjack. Who taught me to ride for beauty, not just function. Who showed me books could be friends and conversation could be art. You're the bravest, strongest, most magnificent person I know. Margaret sobbed against his chest. I've missed you so much. Every day, every hour. I wrote letters I never sent, dreamed dreams I knew couldn't come true. And now you're here. But Jake, we still have the same problems. Society will never accept us. Denver society accepts me fine, Jake said dryly. Your brother nearly choked on his champagne when the governor asked my opinion on territorial development. Margaret pulled back, staring at him. You met Richard at the governor's ball. He wasn't pleased to see what I'd become. Jake touched her face gently. But I don't care about society, Margaret. I care about you. About us. About the life we could build together. My aunt will disown me. Then we'll make our own family. People will talk. Let them, our real friends, will stand by us. Jake went to one knee, holding up the ring. Margaret Whitmore, I've loved you since you laughed at me for smelling like horses. I've loved you through your cruelty and your kindness, your pride and your vulnerability. I've rebuilt myself to be worthy of you. But the truth is, you've always been too good for me. You always will be. But if you'll have me anyway, I promise to spend every day trying to deserve you. Will you marry me? Margaret looked down at him. Through her tears, this man who'd saved her life, forgiven her worst behavior, and transformed himself for love of her. The boy from the lumber camp was gone, replaced by a man of substance and character. But in his blue eyes, she saw the same steady devotion that had always been there. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Jake slipped the ring onto her finger, where it had always belonged. Then he stood and kissed her, pouring 2 years of longing into the embrace. Margaret clung to him, laughing and crying at once. My aunt will have vapors, she said against his lips. Richard will have an apoplexy. Society will be scandalized. And you? Jake asked, pulling back to see her face. What will you have? Margaret's smile was radiant. Everything I ever wanted. A life of meaning. Work that matters. And a man who sees me truly. She touched his face wonderingly. You came for me. After everything, you came. I would have come sooner, but I had promises to keep. To myself. To your memory. To the future I hoped we'd have. And now we go home, Jake said firmly. Back to Silver Ridge, where our friends are waiting. We'll marry in the little church where my mother is buried, with Tom and Mary, and everyone who matters there to witness. You'll help me run the business. I need someone with your intelligence and education. We'll build a good life. Margaret, not a perfect one, maybe, but a real one. Margaret kissed him again. It sounds perfect to me. They were married 3 weeks later. In a simple ceremony that scandalized San Francisco society and delighted Silver Ridge. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, taken in to fit her smaller frame. Jake wore his best suit and a smile that wouldn't quit. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer from their friends could be heard clear down Main Street. That night, in the house Jake had built during her absence, a modest but beautiful home with views of the mountains, Margaret stood in her husband's arms, watching snow fall on the peaks. No regrets? Jake asked softly. Only one, Margaret said, turning in his embrace. That it took us so long to get here. Maybe we needed that time, Jake suggested, to become who we are now. Margaret considered this, then smiled. Then it was worth it, every moment of pain, every day apart. It brought us to this. To this, Jake agreed, and kissed his wife as the snow continued to fall, blessing their new beginning with its gentle grace. 5 years later, Margaret Sullivan stood on the platform of the Silver Ridge train station, watching the eastbound train disappear into the morning mist. In her arms, 2-year-old Mary babbled happily, pointing at the departing locomotive with chubby fingers. "Train, go by," Mary announced, her father's blue eyes bright with excitement. "Yes, darling, the train is going bye-bye," Margaret agreed, shifting her daughter to her hip. At 41, she'd never imagined she'd be chasing a toddler, but life had been full of surprises since marrying Jake. "There are my girls," Jake's voice called out. He strode down the platform, 4-year-old James riding on his shoulders. Their son had Margaret's dark hair and stubborn chin, a combination that promised interesting times ahead. "Papa, I saw the train." Mary reached for her father, who swooped her up in his free arm, carrying both children with the easy strength that still made Margaret's heart flutter. "Did you see who was on it?" Jake asked, settling James on the ground, but keeping Mary, who was decidedly Papa's girl. "Uncle Richard," James piped up. "He gave me a penny." Margaret and Jake exchanged amused glances. Richard's transformation over the past 5 years had been nearly as dramatic as Jake's. The loss of the family fortune to bad investments had humbled him, and Jake's offer of a position managing the Denver office of Sullivan Lumber had shocked everyone. Most of all, Richard. "Your husband is either a saint or a fool," Richard had told Margaret when he'd accepted the job. "He's neither," she'd replied. "He's just a man who believes in second chances." Now Richard was one of their most trusted employees, and a devoted uncle to their children. His visit this week had been to discuss expanding operations to California, a venture that would triple their holdings if successful. "Shall we head home?" Jake asked, wrapping his free arm around Margaret's waist. "Mrs. Chen is making her famous dumplings for lunch." They walked through Silver Ridge, greeting neighbors and friends. The town had grown with Sullivan Lumber's success, new businesses sprouting up to serve the expanding population. Margaret had opened a school with her earnings from the company, fulfilling a dream she'd never known she had. "Mrs. Sullivan." Young Tommy Bradley, Tom's son, ran up to them. "Ma wanted me to remind you about the church social Sunday. She says you promised to bring your apple cake. Tell your mother I wouldn't dream of forgetting." Margaret laughed, as they approached. Their home expanded now to accommodate their growing family and frequent guests. Danny emerged from the workshop Jake had built for him. Despite his limp, Danny had become a master furniture maker, his pieces sought after as far as Denver. "Letter came for you, Margaret," Danny said, handing over an envelope. "From Boston." Margaret recognized the handwriting immediately. Her cousin Charlotte, one of the few family members who'd maintained contact after her marriage. She opened it as they entered the house, scanning quickly. "What is it?" Jake asked, settling the children with their toys. "Charlotte's daughter is getting married. She's inviting us to the wedding." "In Boston?" Margaret looked up at Jake with wonder. "She says society is curious about the frontier lumber baron and his wife. Apparently, we've become quite the romantic legend." Jake laughed, pulling her into his arms. "The lumberjack and the lady. I suppose it does sound like a fairy tale. Except fairy tales don't usually include account ledgers and midnight feedings," Margaret said dryly. But she was smiling. "Mama, story," James demanded, tugging at her skirts. "Story," Mary echoed, not to be outdone. They settled in the parlor. Children cuddled between them, as Margaret began their favorite tale, about a proud princess who met a brave woodcutter in an enchanted forest. Jake listened with half-closed eyes, occasionally adding sound effects that made the children giggle. "And did they live happily ever after?" James asked sleepily, though he knew the answer. "They lived happily," Margaret said, looking at Jake over their children's heads. "Ever after is a very long time, so we'll have to wait and see. But they were happy every single day, even the hard ones, because they were together." "That's a good story," Mary mumbled, already drifting toward sleep. Later, after the children were napping, Jake found Margaret in her study, working on the school's curriculum. He set a cup of tea beside her, then bent to kiss her neck. "Any regrets?" he asked. Their old ritual. Margaret turned in her chair to face him. 5 years had added lines around his eyes, and a few gray strands to his dark hair, but he was still the handsomest man she'd ever seen. More importantly, he was hers. Only one, she said, as always. That we wasted so much time fighting what was meant to be. Maybe we needed that time, Jake responded, completing their liturgy. To become who we are now. Margaret stood, wrapping her arms around his neck. A frontier lumber baron and his scandalous wife. A man and woman who fought for love and won. Jake corrected, kissing her soundly. Outside, snow began to fall on Silver Ridge, dusting the mountains with fresh white. In the Sullivan house, children slept peacefully, while their parents worked side by side, building a life and a legacy together. The lumberjack who'd smelled of horses had become a respected businessman. The lady who'd mocked him had become his partner in every sense. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was better. It was real, complicated, sometimes difficult, but always worth fighting for. Margaret had been wrong that day by the lake, when she'd said sometimes there wasn't another way. Sometimes, love didn't mean letting go. Sometimes, it meant holding on with everything you had. Transforming yourself and your life, until you became the person capable of building the future you dreamed of. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, and very determined, you got to live that dream every single day. In the parlor, little Mary stirred and called out. Jake and Margaret went to her together, as they did everything now. Partners, lovers, friends, and family. The proud lady and the humble lumberjack had found their happily ever after. Not in spite of their differences, but because of how those differences had shaped them into exactly who they needed to be. For each other, forever.